De fleste af jer har sikkert set en TED-talk på YouTube, hvor både teknologien, men også kommunikationen er i top. Og udover at tale til et lokalt publikum, så henvender en oplægsholder i en TED-talk sig jo også til et publikum, der kun deltager via en skærm. Og det er ikke tilfældigt, om en oplægsholder i en TED-talk er god til at nå ud til publikummet på den anden side. Det kræver nogle helt praktiske samarbejdsredskaber og nogle præsentationsteknikker, som kan kompensere for eksempel den øjenkontakt, som I jo talte om er ret vigtig, og som kan være en hjælp til at inddrage dem, der sidder bag skærmen, til at være en del af mødet. Og det vil Diane Windingland, som er Virtual Speech Coach, nu går i detaljer med i sit oplæg. Så please welcome Diane Windingland.
Thank you. I don't know what you said, but I'm sure it was very nice. It was a month ago on a Sunday at 6:15 in the morning, before the sun was even up, when I grabbed a cup of coffee, I sat down at my desk, and I logged on to do the technology check for a webinar that I would be presenting in half an hour. Now, you might be wondering, why 6:15 in the morning on a Sunday? Well, this was a webinar that was going to be cast in Iran, and they were 9.5 hours ahead of me. I wasn't too worried. We had done the dry run just the day before, which was a little complicated because we had the platform for the software, we had the video, we had also an interpreter because it was in another language, in the Persian language, so I had to practice with the interpreter, speaking English, and then he would interpret what I said. But everything went great. Now, you probably know where I'm going with this. At 6:15 in the morning that Sunday, everything did not go great. Maybe you've had something like that happen too. There were only two things that worked that morning. The first was just the first slide. That was all that worked. It was a picture of me about 50 pounds ago and a picture of the organizer. And I had written in Google Translate in English, thank you, and had it translate into Farsi, the Persian language. So I hoped that's what it said anyway. I practiced saying thank you, and that's all I got to say, and then everything went haywire. Now, virtual communication has such promise for connecting us across the world, so that travel doesn't have to be the barrier to communication or high cost. That's the promise of virtual communication. But all too often, do you ever feel like this? Sometimes it's the technology, but other times it's the people who are using the technology and their communication skills. Today, in my short time, you'll discover how you can create and deliver engaging content to a virtual audience. There are three basic virtual communication steps. The first, get ready. Plan for success. Because if you fail to plan, you will be planning for failure. A virtual communication session usually takes a lot more planning than a meeting in person. There are many details that have to be considered, just like for planning this meeting today. Many details, right? You made it look easy. But when it works great, but there's a lot of planning involved. The second step is to get set, to actually create the content, to create the information that you will be sharing in a way that you can go and deliver engaging content. So let's get ready for success. The first step in any communication should start with why. And communication isn't just about you. You want to know, why does your audience, or why do the participants even care? Think about your communication based on the people you're going to be communicating with. What is important to them? What is relevant to them? If you're going to take up their time, why would they even care? After you have the why, then you can start planning your communication. You want to plan the audience or the participant's experience. You may have time zone considerations, culture considerations, language considerations. For example, when I was working to talk with the people in Iran, 9.5 hours, that's a big time zone difference. In fact, 2 days before, the interpreter had called me at midnight because he forgot that there was such a big time zone difference. So I go online, look for a time zone converter to make sure that I get the time right. And then there's also culture. There may be cultural differences in communication. There may be things that are offensive in one culture that aren't in another. I found that out, fortunately, before the webinar with Iran, that the thumbs up signal, which was, to me, just meant good job, and I did confirm that that's not an offensive gesture here. I had been texting with the program planner for the webinar, and I had given him the thumbs up icon just to let him know, hey, great, I agree with you. And then all of a sudden I realized, oops, that might not be a good gesture there. And I texted him, is that a bad gesture there? And he said, yeah, but I know you just meant everything was great, but don't use it on the webinar. So you've got to consider culture and sometimes language. Now, usually you'll probably be speaking in a common language such as English, but once in a while you may have an interpreter. But even if you have a common language, for some people, the common language is not their first language. So you may need to have shorter sentences and use simpler words. Consider also the participants' facility with the technology. You need to practice with the technology, but don't assume that everybody else knows how to use it. You may need to send explicit directions. You may need to send them a tutorial so that they can practice ahead of time as well. And don't assume total familiarity with the information you may be sharing. And that will be dependent on how much you've worked with the people in the past. But if you're forming a new team or working with someone you haven't worked with before, they may not have the level of information that you do. I sometimes think of it as, well, one of my favorite Danish toys is Legos, right? That was developed here, started here. So think of it this way. If you're an expert or you know a lot about something, it's like you've created this elaborate Lego structure. And the other person, if they don't know much, they might just have one Lego brick. And it's like you're trying to place your whole structure on their Lego brick, and it's just overwhelming. So you may need to consider how you could simplify the information or make it less complex. Also consider the participants' environment. If they're using mobile technology to connect with the meeting, they have a very small screen. If you have dense information that you're presenting visually, that may be hard for them to see. Also consider what kind of environment they're in and what kind of environment you're in as well. And always have a backup plan or two. You have a plan A if everything goes smoothly. Well, rarely does everything go smoothly. So have a plan B and possibly a plan C. So for this webinar to Iran that just wasn't going to happen the way we planned, we actually did have a plan B that didn't work. And so we went to plan C. A few days before the webinar, I practiced doing the webinar as a presentation at home using the PowerPoint on my TV and a video camera just to record me, and I sent that ahead. So what ended up happening, and this is the audience in Iran, this is the video they're playing of me giving the presentation in front of my TV set. And the interpreter would pause every now and then so the live audience could actually understand what I was saying. There was also an online audience on a webinar platform. And the one thing I was able to do was to participate in the chat, which was interesting because I don't write the Persian language at all. So I would see someone write something and I would cut or copy and paste it into Google Translate, see what they said. You know, I could get the gist of it anyway. And then I would write something in English, translate it into the Persian language, copy and paste into the chat. They loved it. What might have been a disaster turned out great. And at one point, the interpreter shared with the live audience something I said, like, you know, maybe I should just come do a live presentation. And they stood up and clapped. I'm like, hey, this turned out okay. So always have backup plans. Sometimes the backup plans work even better. So once you get ready by planning, you want to get set. You want to create captivating content. Even if you're only talking to 1 or 2 people, you may have visuals that you want to share. So when you're sharing content, what do you think is the #1 problem with content? Ideas? Any ideas on what might be the #1 problem? There's no wrong answers. Just what do you think might be the #1? How about you? Information overload. I would say that is basically the #1 problem. That is the #1 problem. In fact, did you even see significance? With all the information that you can give people, significance can be lost. As you're providing information, the tendency is to want to overdo it, to shovel it in. And people then don't know what's important. They don't know what to focus on. So consider reducing your information into bite-sized pieces. Consider the power of one. Have one big idea for your message or the meeting, or one big outcome that you want to have for the meeting. And if you're using visuals, a presentation software, try to have only one idea per slide. And that will mean you will have to have more visuals if you only have one idea per slide. But in a virtual environment, having more visual engagement to have people look at something will keep them more engaged. So having more slides in a virtual environment can be a good thing as long as there's not too much information on them. Before you get started, you want to have a defining statement for the meeting or the presentation. So here would be an example of a template that you could have. I'm teaching whatever your specific content is to a specific audience so that they can have a specific learning objective or an action step. This is for you to have a clarifying statement so that you don't go all over the place in a meeting. It also is a good place to start for developing an agenda for a meeting as well. So here's an example of my defining statement for this presentation. I'm teaching virtual communication skills to a university and corporate audience so that they can create and deliver engaging content. So that was my defining statement. But it's not all about me. It's about you and about your audience and about the other meeting participants. So tweak that and turn it around into an audience benefit statement. This would be a statement that you would say at the beginning of a meeting, letting people know the purpose, or at the beginning of a presentation. And I said something very similar to this at the beginning of this presentation. You will discover how to create and deliver engaging virtual content to a virtual audience. Then I suggest, before you get too narrow-focused, to allow you and perhaps people you're collaborating with, if you're planning a meeting or even a presentation, some brainstorming time. What do we really want to cover? What's important? And there's lots of ways you can do brainstorming, from paper to whiteboard to software. I personally like using the sticky Post-it notes, but don't start in PowerPoint or your presentation software, because then you may just get tunnel visioned too soon. So this is a door in my home, and those are sticky Post-it notes for this presentation. I was brainstorming, and I put them on the door in a much messier fashion than this. And then I just kind of stared at them for a while, and groupings emerged, and I rearranged them, took some things out, added other things. And so this was my starting point with brainstorming for this presentation. And you can do the same thing collaboratively as well. You could have several people come up with ideas and then arrange it into something that makes sense. Consider yourself a master chef when it comes to mixing engaging content. There are 3 particularly engaging ingredients that you can have in your communication. The first is stories, and this doesn't mean just fairy tale type stories, but it could be case studies. It could be examples. Typically, stories are interesting if there is a problem that needs to be overcome. You can also have compelling visuals to keep people focused. And very importantly, you need some interaction. It can't be all just one way. Stories engage the mind. Since the time of the cavemen, sitting around a fire, talking about stories of conquest and food sources, stories have been how we make sense out of the world. Stories are to our mind the way water is to a fish. We can't even imagine life without creating a narrative for story. And stories stick. In the book, Made to Stick, Why Some Ideas Survive and Others Die, the authors, Chip and Dan Heath, tell about a class that Chip teaches at Stanford University. In this class, he gives his students some statistics on property crime rates, and then asks them to give 1-minute speeches either for or against the seriousness of nonviolent crime. The typical student cites 2.5 statistics, and only 1 in 10 tells a story. He then distracts the students with a clip of a Monty Python movie, this is college, and then after the clip, he asks them to remember what they recall about the previous presentations. Well, only 1 out of 20 students could recall a single statistic other than the ones they used in their presentations. But if someone told a story, 2 out of 3 people remembered the story. Now, I just told you a story that was full of statistics that you'll probably forget, but you might remember the point that people remember stories much more than they remember statistics. Stories engage the mind. Psychologist Jerome Bruner has done research that says that if you wrap a statistic in story, people are 22 times more likely to remember it. So consider, if you have data to present, how could you present that data in more of a story format, perhaps with a case study? A little more on statistics versus story very quickly. I'm going to compare two families and their food consumption. Now, this might be a typical way to present that information. This is a family in the US, and they spend $342 a week on groceries, which is about 1,900 kroner. I just did the math on that. And I don't know if that's a lot here for groceries, but it's a lot in the US to spend that much. Contrast that with the family from Chad and what they typically spend, about $1.23 a week, about 7 kroner. That's not much to spend on groceries wherever you're at. But this is kind of a boring way to present this information. Could there be another way? Maybe stories, maybe with visuals? Here is the family in the US. I hope you guys don't eat like this. That's a lot of food, a lot of processed food too. Let's contrast that with the family in Chad. They have 2 more people in their family. If I were to do a bar chart showing the difference in what they spend, actually I did, and it's so ridiculous because the Chad family's here and the US family is here. But showing a picture, and I could have told you more of a story, is much more memorable than that bulleted list, isn't it? You want to try to make information visual as much as you can. So here is my family and where we were all born in a bulleted list. I was born in Oregon in the western US. My oldest son was born in California. My daughter was also born in California. My youngest son was born in Russia. We adopted him when he was 12. And my husband was born in South Korea. Woohoo! Very exciting, huh? Well, maybe there's a better way to present this information visually. What if I put a map of the world up here? And as I gave you the information, just had our pictures pop up where we were all born. That's more interesting. Now, if you were on a webinar or you were looking at someone presenting visual information and they just told you while they were talking and these pictures popped up, you would stay engaged because of the change and because there's faces and it's more visual and not just text. Here's another brief example. I do a presentation on leadership, and this used to be a slide that I had in that presentation. Very simple slide. I would say something like, situational leadership is all about leaders, followers, and the situation. Okay, easy, kind of boring slide, but how could I make it more visual? So now I changed that slide to be, situational leadership is all about leaders, followers, and the situation. Now, a little bit of humor, although you have to be careful when considering humor across cultures, a little bit of humor also engages the mind quite well. But again, I didn't even try to be funny when I was doing the webinar for the Iranian group, because I thought, I'll just get it wrong, so I'll just go straight with them. You do want to, in a presentation format, plan interaction every 3 to 5 minutes. And you also want to have interaction meetings, and we'll talk about that in a moment as well. So if you've used a webinar platform or you've been in a virtual presentation meeting, just by a show of hands, let me know if you've ever attended a virtual presentation. Okay, so almost everyone has attended a virtual presentation. You can have questions as a presenter, and you can even ask questions as a participant and allow people to answer in the chat box. And the ones I've done, typically, I'm the only one talking, so then I will comment on some of the questions using people's names. People love to hear their name. You can do polls or surveys to take a quick temperature on what people feel about something and then discuss that. You can allow participants to use the raise your hand button if they have a question, and then you can answer it. You can ask them to visualize. If you're trying to have people put themselves in a situation, ask them to visualize it, because when people visualize themselves in a situation, that's when they're really engaged. You could use the technology, such as the whiteboard technology that many of the platforms have available. People can interact with that, and the technology is changing all the time. It's getting better and better. So whatever platform you have available to use, learn the technology so that you can apply it appropriately. Now, looking at more one-on-one or small group interaction, I have a few pointers here. I call them the 4 gets. Don't forget, the 4 gets of engagement. The first get is to get small. You want to reduce the number of people that are in your virtual meeting to the smallest number in order to have an effective meeting. Because when you add participants in a virtual meeting where there's a lot of two-way conversation, it gets like that opening video where they didn't have visuals, but you didn't even know one person was in the meeting until the very end, and people don't know when to talk. So the fewer participants you have, the easier it will usually go. The other way you want to get small is in time. You want to keep your meetings as short as possible, because it's hard enough to keep people's attention as long as we have kept your attention today in a live meeting. In a virtual meeting, oh, there are so many distractions, aren't there? There's cell phones, there's email, there's work that needs to get done, there's people talking to you that may be coming into your office. So you want to limit all of that if you can. You want to get personal. Now, I don't mean get too personal, but as you saw in some of the examples, a little bit of chit-chat at the beginning, especially if there's technical problems, can really make people feel like they're in this together. They're a team, they're connected. And if you don't have any chit-chat, people feel like it's just a sterile meeting. There are probably, as I know there are, some differences with different cultures. But in most cultures, a little bit of chit-chat at the beginning will help warm up the participants. Also, using people's names. Do you remember when you were in school and maybe you were daydreaming about that person you wanted to date, and then the teacher says your name? Whoa! That got your attention, didn't it? And it works in virtual meetings too. You have some participants, you can call on them. So, Mary, what did you think about that particular idea? And allow them to participate. You also want to consider allowing people to get focused. Now, you may need to set some ground rules and actually specifically state, please close your email, turn off your phone, just so that you can have people agree to reduce distractions. And that means you have to do it too. I know it's really easy to want to keep everything up thinking that you can multitask, but multitasking is a lie. We do not pay attention to two things at once very well. You also want to consider the background noise, like the one with the dog barking in the background. That has happened to me. I have twin granddaughters, and someone called for a virtual call. They got the time zone wrong, but I took it anyway, probably a mistake. And I had screaming 2-year-olds in the background. It didn't go very well. The fourth get is to get encouraging. And what I mean by get encouraging is to use facial expressions and body language that encourages people to talk. And a smile is probably one of the warmest, most encouraging things you can do to let people feel like they're not being intimidated. You can also nod. When someone's talking and you nod a little bit, that lets them know you're in agreement, you're in sync, and you want them to keep going. You probably noticed, I think in one of the examples, that averting eye contact is a great way to make people stop. So I guess you could use that tool too. Just don't look at the person. Or put your hand up, stop. No, but you want to be polite when you do it. You may need to have gestures. You may need to come up with gestures that will work. Like, if you're off agenda, to hold the hand up, and that'll be something that will be put to the side. So get small, get personal, get focused, and get encouraging. Another gesture I found, if you have the kind of video where you can see your arm movement, as you can gesture as you would naturally, but an open upward palm gesture as you're talking will encourage people to talk like I'm doing right now. It will be encouraging. In fact, if you want someone to answer a question and they can see you, tell me, which of these two situations would you be more likely to want to answer the question? This one where like, so do you have any questions? Or this one, what questions do you have? So consider how your body language, if you're visible, will convey information, interaction, and engagement. That's part of delivering to engage. So go. Eye contact. That is the big challenge sometimes, once you get past the technical challenge, is keeping that eye contact. All too often you have what's like in the upper two pictures. In this case, the webcam is probably about chest level, and people are looking at the screen. We naturally look at faces and not so much at the webcam. And that creates what I call dysfunctional eye contact, because you're not really making eye contact like you are in the bottom pictures. But technology is changing fast in this area, as we've already heard about today. And this particular slide actually came from when I did a search on virtual eye contact. There is a company that has face recognition software that will adjust the faces so it looks like you have eye contact. It's simulated eye contact. But, that's not here yet and probably more expensive than many of us would want to spend money on. So what do you do with that webcam not being where a person's face is? Well, one thing I've done is I've created, and this is so expensive, a little Webcam Buddy. In fact, I brought my Webcam Buddy with me here today. And what it helps me do is it helps me remember to look at the webcam when I'm talking. Because when I'm talking, I want to come across as very sincere and personable. And then when the other person talks, I usually just look at my screen so that I can see what they're saying. So that's just one little very low-tech way that you could try to be more engaging. Sometimes, like in the video that the conference was opened at, nobody sees anybody. So what do you do there? I have what I call my audience on a stick, where, for example, this is a friend of mine who has a business helping women be successful professionals. And on Thursday, she had a radio interview with me, not really radio because it was online, where I was on my phone, and because I had a lot of stuff to do before coming, I was actually sitting in the parking lot of the beauty parlor where I was going to get my hair cut, on my phone doing this radio interview, and I stuck her picture on a ruler and brought it with me in my car. So when we were talking, I could be talking to her like she was sitting right next to me. And this will also work if you have colleagues in faraway places and you're doing a telephone or teleconference. Go ahead, who cares what people think? Stick up their pictures and you can talk to them even though you can't see them. And this really helps you feel more connected and makes you sound more conversational as well. So how do you sound conversational? Now, if you're just doing a regular meeting, it's not that difficult, where you can see people, they can see you. Sometimes it's just a little awkward, like we saw in the previous video. It's like they forgot poor Dan. Dan was there, but it's like they weren't paying attention to him. They were having side meetings. Well, if you're paying attention, you can sound conversational. But sometimes, for example, if you can't see people, it's really hard sometimes to talk because we count on what their faces are looking like to get feedback to adjust our communication. And when you don't have that, it's difficult to sound conversational. So here's some things you can do. If they can't see you, I suggest you stand while you talk, because standing will help up your energy, it'll help you sound convincing, and it'll help you sound more confident as well. Or sit tall, don't like slump in your chair. Smile. When I was a little girl, my mother told me to always answer the phone with a smile because people could hear my smile through the phone. Like, really, Mom? So instead of saying, hello, I had to do this. It was, hello. And yes, you do sound different when you smile. Pick up the pace, not a race. But most people, especially if they can't see the people they're talking to, unless they've written out what they're going to say, which is a bad idea, they tend to talk slower because they don't really know how the person is receiving their information. And it sounds kind of stilted. So generally, you want to pick up to a conversational pace, but don't forget to pause now and then to allow people to absorb what you're saying, maybe to ask a question. And vary your pitch. I don't know what happens. Sometimes people use technology and it's like they become a robot where they just sort of sound monotone, and maybe you'll understand what I'm talking about today. So go ahead, get excited. Hopefully you're excited about what you're discussing. And if you are doing a presentation or trying to stick to an agenda, don't have it all written out like a script, because that will keep you from being present in the moment. It will also likely make you sound stilted. So remember, you want to plan interaction every 3 to 5 minutes. And if you take these steps of getting ready by planning for success, planning to take the time to have the dry run and to have backup plans, and then get set to create that engaging content so that people will stay with you, so that you can hook them in and lure them along with planned engagement and planned interaction, and then go deliver the content that will engage by sounding conversational, by including others. Don't be like this guy. Don't make other people feel like this guy. So let's not have that happen. Sometimes you can't help the technology, but you can certainly help what you do in your virtual communication so that we can start to realize the happy promise of virtual communication throughout the world, bringing us all closer together, that we can have engaging and interesting and productive communication. Thank you for inviting me today.
Thank you very much, Diane. Her fik vi alle sammen nogle praktiske teknikker, som vi kan bruge til vores næste møde.